Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, dear audience. We welcome all of you to our special webinars episode today titled International Human Rights Day, COVID-19 and Human Rights. Those who have joined us, we especially appreciate your time and your energy on joining in this very special topic where we are going to discuss about COVID-19 and its impact on human rights issues globally. Before we begin, let me do the treaty recognition. Conflict and Resilience Research Institute Canada is located on original lands of Anishinaabe, Cree, Ojibwe, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and on the homeland of Métis Nation. We respect the treaties that were made on these territories. We acknowledge the harms and mistakes of the past, and we dedicate ourselves to move forward in partnerships with Indigenous communities in a spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. Ladies and gentlemen, as I said, today is a very special day, 10th of December, globally celebrated as International Human Rights Day. I am reading a just very small quote from Eleanor Roosevelt when she said about this day, and I quote here, "Where after all do human rights begin? In small places, close to home, so close and so small that they cannot be seen on any maps of the world. Unless these rights have meaning there, they have little meaning anywhere. Without concerted citizen action to uphold them close to home, we shall look in vain for progress in the larger world." Unquote. Dear audience, on this particular day, the United Nations General Assembly in 1948 adopted Universal Declaration of Human Rights, commonly known as briefly or abbreviated form UDHR. This milestone document proclaims the inalienable rights that everyone is entitled as a human being, as a human species in this world, regardless of race, color, religion, sex, language, political, or other opinion, national or social origin, and social status. United Nations declared today, this year, the theme as equality, reducing inequalities and advancing human rights. With this brief background, ladies and gentlemen, let me welcome our moderator, Khujista Rahman, to conduct the webinar today. And we have designed this particular episode in a very conversational tone, and we have a guest, a practicing lawyer and a faculty member from University of Manitoba, and I'm sure our moderator is going to introduce her properly with you folks. So without further ado, let me welcome Khujista Rahman on the floor. Khujista, floor is yours, ma'am.
Thank you, Dr. Kawser. Good evening, everyone. I'm Khujista, a researcher at the Conflict and Resilience Research Institute Canada. I'll be moderating the webinar today. We're hosting this webinar to commemorate International Human Rights Day, which falls on December 10th each year. Like Dr. Kawser said, the theme of this International Human Rights Day is equality, reducing inequalities, and advancing human rights. Given the fact that COVID-19 has deepened poverty, raised inequality, and other gaps in human rights protection, we decided to dedicate this webinar to discussing COVID-19 and its impact on human rights. Today, our esteemed speakers will be responding to two questions. The first being, in your opinion and or experience, how has COVID-19 disrupted lives and impacted human rights? And the second being, what kind of measures do you feel should be in place to help navigate these human rights violations that have arisen from COVID-19? Joining us today, we have Sarah Lugtig. Sarah has a background in social work, social policy, and law, having worked as a social worker with youth, families, and newcomers in Winnipeg's inner city, and as a social policy analyst with the Manitoba Métis Federation, as a policy analyst, lawyer, and legislative drafter with Manitoba Justice, and as a human rights lawyer for the Manitoba Human Rights Commission and the Court Challenges Program of Canada. She is passionate about human rights and equal access to justice. Sarah has learned through her work that law and policy-related strategies can play an important role in advancing equality and social justice, provided that affected communities are in the driver's seat. Strategies must also recognize the importance of an ongoing relationship between the settler society and First Nations, Inuit and Métis peoples that is built on respect and the fulfillment of settler society's long-standing commitments and responsibilities to Indigenous peoples. Sarah has a BSW from the University of Manitoba and a joint LLB and MSW degree from McGill University and has taught both law and social work courses at the university level. Next, we have Dr. Kawser Ahmed. Dr. Kawser is Executive Director at the Conflict and Resilience Research Institute Canada. He's also an educator and a researcher in peace and conflict studies who has in-depth understanding of social conflict and its peaceful transformation. While serving in the UN peacekeeping operations in conflict zones, he earned experience in peace building, mediation, and transformative dialogue in resolving inter-group conflict. He developed insights in conflict by studying social resistance, terrorism, and extremism in global and local contexts. He undertook several research projects on community-focused conflict intervention, refugee crisis, and youth extremism in Western and non-Western contexts. His publication encompasses topics such as peace building, counter-radicalization, economic aid, conflict intervention, national counterterrorism strategies, and UN peacekeeping operations. Our esteemed speakers, I welcome you today to this webinar. And thank you attendees for joining us. We are so very excited to have you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So we'll start with the first speaker, Sarah, to talk on today's first question, which is, in your opinion and or experience, how has COVID-19 disrupted lives and impacted human rights? Sarah, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. And thank you to the CRRIC for inviting me to be part of the discussion today. As I was just saying to my colleagues here today, this is a very important day to me, and to be able to participate in such an important discussion, it feels like an honor. So I'm really looking forward to our time together. So when I thought about this question, I found that my focus was on the particular human rights that relate to equality and freedom from discrimination. And I noted that that's very much been a focus of the UN as well from your comments. And so I'd like to talk a little bit about situations where the disruption that COVID-19 has brought in Canada has had a particularly disproportionate impact on equity-seeking groups or equality-seeking groups. And would these all be considered human rights violations? What I would say is they're definitely evidence of the potential of human rights violations and require us to very carefully look at what's happening and what responsibilities those organizations and institutions have in the particular situation to determine whether there are obligations from a human rights perspective that need to be addressed and what those responsibilities are. So, and just to, as sort of a bit of background, our right to equality in Canada exists vis-a-vis governments, and all government action under the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, Section 15, the right to equality. But we also have the right to be free from discrimination in obtaining services that are available to the public, in housing and employment, regardless of whether it's a private sector actor or a government actor under Manitoba's Human Rights Code and the Canadian Human Rights Act. So when I'm thinking about human rights protections today, I'm also thinking about those particular laws. And I'm focusing on impact, differential impact that relates to protected grounds under these two laws, because that's how in Canada, our courts and tribunals have assessed, first and foremost, whether there is a potential inequality or discrimination that may be violating those laws. It's absolutely critical to determine what is the impact in the surrounding social context of a particular law, policy, or practice, or in the way services are provided. Is a protected characteristic a factor in that impact, and is it having some type of detriment for a protected group compared to other groups in society? And when I take that lens and I look at some of the significant disruptions that COVID-19 has caused, it seems to me there's almost always a differential impact, and that at least in some cases we can trace that impact to decisions that have been made by policymakers, by government, by service providers. And if I have a few more minutes, I'll just go through a couple of those examples. So the first one I think we need to start with is the impact of COVID-19 itself. Dr. Theresa Tam, who I know you all know, the Chief Public Health Officer for Canada, has noted that the health impacts of COVID-19 have been worse for seniors, essential workers, racialized population, people living with disabilities, women, and Indigenous communities, and that we need to improve the health, social, and economic conditions for these populations if we are going to achieve health equity and protect us all from the threat of the pandemic. So already we're in a scenario in Canada and around the world, it's not just us, where the harms of COVID-19 are much more significant for groups that are already experiencing discrimination and oppression. And I know I was shocked, but maybe not surprised when we saw the data about the impact of the particular impact on racialized groups and Indigenous communities in Manitoba. There was publicly available data on that, and the likelihood of infection and then serious outcome was much higher if you were a member of one of those groups. So that's my first one I wanted to mention. A second one I think that's very commonly affected many of us is the whole conflict between childcare responsibilities and work responsibilities. This has looked different depending on the time, sort of where you are in the arc of the pandemic. But as a result of the pandemic, parents have been in a situation where really it's impossible for them to meet all of their responsibilities. And in many cases have ended up resigning, losing work, suffering work consequences, and what have you, because of that inability to juggle family responsibilities and work responsibilities. And family status, parental status, is a protected characteristic from an equality perspective. And so when we see the impact, particularly on women, particularly on people who are overrepresented among precarious employment without benefits, again, there's an equality dimension to the impact on families of that conflict of responsibilities. Another issue I wanted to highlight that demonstrates this inequitable impact is the provision of essential services that normally we had access to in person and then became or still are only available online or by phone. Many of us, that may not have been an issue. We could easily talk to our doctor. I helped someone go to a physiotherapist appointment online. But for many people, again, often from an already disadvantaged or discriminated against group, this change actually resulted in a complete bar to healthcare services. And it could be because phones were not available, internet access was not reliable, the training needed to access whatever platform it wasn't available or wasn't accessible. And if you think about the situation of being in the midst of a pandemic and not being able to access health information and healthcare, again, that's a very serious potential equality issue. And finally, I'm going to end with another example, and there are many, many. I'll be very interested to hear what other examples and situations others have identified. Many changes happen to our built environment, and by this I mean sort of the buildings that we're accessing, this, when you're going to the store, what have you, and a lot of changes had to be put in place quickly to allow for social distancing and other measures like that. And I know anecdotally that many people with disabilities, visual impairments, physical impairments, mobility, health conditions, many seniors were facing a lot of barriers when this happened because the changes were made very quickly. And for example, you might be able to use an automatic door opener to go into a mall, but it wouldn't be accessible for you to come out of a mall because everyone had to enter through one door and exit through one door. People were not able to access visual aids that were there to advise them how to safely be in a building. So that's even another more practical example. So these are just a few examples, but I think demonstrate that there are definitely potential human rights issues that have arisen probably whenever there's been a disruption due to the pandemic. And often it's because decisions were made quickly, The people most affected were not around the table or weren't accessed by the decision makers. They might not have had the tools and knowledge that they needed. And there are many other factors as well. So I'll just end with that, if that's okay. And I'm looking forward to hearing further comments.
Thank you, Sarah. I agree. Governing bodies and policymakers need to look further when developing policies because at-risk and vulnerable groups will face different impacts of almost any policy, whether it's in Canada or globally. Dr. Kawser, the same question for you. In your opinion and or experience, how has COVID-19 disrupted lives and impacted human rights? The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Khujista, for the question. I think it's a very poignant question to start with. And the audience, I would like to go back to Sarah's comment, and she was referring to a report. And I was also aware of this report, which was published, if I'm not wrong, in February this year from Public Health Agency of Canada. And in that particular report, Public Health Agency of Canada, and of course, it comes from the Teresa Tam's office. I'm just going to share very, I would say, snippets of that report, which is really interesting because the whole report starts with this idea that although the report did not focus exactly on race issues with regards to COVID-19 and its direct impact, but it is saying that the racialized communities were being disproportionately impacted by COVID-19. It does refer to some of the surveillance data from Toronto and Ottawa. That's all, and it shows 1.5 to 2 times, racialized populations are impacted, comparing SARS and the current one. And it also says, and I'm quoting from the report, that these disproportionate impacts among racialized and indigenous communities are not due to biological differences between groups or population. Rather, they'll reflect existing health inequalities that are strongly influenced by a specific set of social and economic factors. And this is why it is very important that we talk today about COVID-19 and inequality. And also in that report, and I'm not going to read the report and bore you, but it also talks about, and the title of the paragraph is very interesting. It says, "Our history matters." And in saying that, it directly connects our indigenous population and puts them in perspective because this is how it starts. And especially the treatment in this report, it is mentioned about Joyce Ekakwan, if I have pronounced it correctly, of Atikamean Nation, and the treatment towards her during this whole period is a testimony of inequality. That is what the report says. Now, let me focus, my own works in this field. I'm not going to mention directly about my job and where I work, but I had this opportunity working in a public health system of Manitoba for almost 7-8 months. And I have seen personally the inequalities that are built into the structure. And from the angles of peace and conflict studies, we often refer it structural inequality, because we are all part of structures, and every day we interact with structures in many ways. So these structures are already unequal, right? We don't have to look at COVID and other pandemic. It is already there in place. So when COVID comes in, it adds another layer of inequality over the already existing inequalities. And in that particular episode of my working in health, I still remember once we had difficulty in contact tracing of people, of our indigenous brothers and sisters living in the reserve, because we take it granted that in the urban areas, we'll pick up a phone and quickly ask someone, okay, share me with your health information, etc., which is accessible. But folks think about our brothers and sisters living in distant reserve locations where there is no cellular network at all. And how do you reach out to those cases? And we actually don't have much data, although we know that there is an outbreak, okay, and there are special measures taken. But at some point, I have seen myself in my brief exposure to health system that it is really difficult to access people in terms of accessing health data. And I would just would conclude by saying that COVID-19 has its, I mean, any pandemic actually exposes so much of social fissures, especially I'm referring to intergroup, positioning of various people in our society. So likewise, I mean, if you go back 100 years, the Spanish flu, I have read a couple of articles on that in the past. It is the same thing happened, and it kind of impacts people from different social structures differently. And this is why we are talking today about COVID-19 and human rights. And finally, I would say that my current work is involved with refugees and displaced persons in Bangladesh, Myanmar area. So I would hopefully, the moderator might ask me questions down the road. I'm preparing for that. But I'm just going to give you a clue that the COVID-19 impacts those people, I would say vulnerable people, in such a way that we don't have actually much concrete evidence of sharing that this is how statistically they are impacted, because we don't have data. So I will end by saying here that this is what my initial response to your question. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Kawser. I agree, there's so many layers of structural inequalities built in our society, and we should try to commit to equity and support the marginalized communities because they're already struggling before and they need our support a lot more than ever. So we're going to talk on our second and final question, which is, what kind of measures do you feel should be in place to help navigate these human rights violations that have risen from COVID-19? Sarah, we'll begin with you. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. And this is not an easy question to answer, but there are many things that can be done and hopefully will be done. And there certainly are many things that are being done. In my view, the starting point should be to avoid the human rights violations in the first place, if at all possible. And if they arise, or if equality issues arise, to proactively address them as they arise or become evident. So how do you do that? And I would suggest that that decision makers who are determining responses to the pandemic across society be required and resourced to use a human rights or equality lens when they're making decisions and developing policies and practices. And this requires considering whatever decisions they're making or measures they're taking to address the pandemic, what is the impact given the structural inequality that my co-panelist was describing just a few minutes ago? What is that impact within the social context? And then how do we ensure that the benefits or the protections or the safety that is intended to be advanced by whatever measure it is has an equal outcome for all, and that the structural inequalities are not then instead becoming embedded in the COVID response? Because as you said, that's very likely to happen because of the structural and systemic dynamics of inequality, racism, sexism, and so on. So I would say start with a requirement to have a human rights equality lens when making decisions. How do you do that? Obviously, people will need to be educated to do that. They will need to be made responsible for doing that. Resources will be needed, whether they are tools, decision-making documents, examples, resource people, access to connections within affected communities to be consulted, and so on. So I think that's sort of at a beginning point. And then how is that going to be implemented? And I think, Khujista, you were talking about government and other institutions have a responsibility to be ensuring that this happens. So I think governments have a responsibility. I think, and not just like the Human Rights Commission, who I'll mention it in more deep depth in a minute, but all aspects of government that are involved in regulating the response to COVID-19 have a responsibility to ensure that there is a human rights and equality lens taken to the training that they're given, the requirements that they're placing on institutions and service providers and what have you. I also would suggest there may be other entities that are involved in regulating services, such as what came to mind for me was the Law Society that governs lawyers, the colleges that govern health professions. They too have played a very important role in helping to shape the response to COVID-19. And so they too, I think, could help to address some of the systemic inequalities that have arisen by taking that human rights lens and that equality lens. Once that's done, I think what you'll then find is that different and special measures will be needed in many cases, and a different kind of response will be needed to ensure that equality of outcome. So that also needs to be provided, and it needs to be resourced. We've seen some examples of this. I believe that Dr. Ahmed, you probably have better knowledge of how this has been carried out within Manitoba, both the strengths and the challenges that we've had. But I think that that type of a response is of special measures is absolutely necessary. And then finally, what happens if there is a violation and there isn't a response? And I think also what has happened is some issues have bubbled up where there is a human rights dimension and nobody really knows the answer. Like, is there a responsibility to do this differently? Isn't it? Is this an equality issue? And for those, traditionally, usually we have access to courts and tribunals and a decision maker who makes, and it's often some kind of legal process to sort of reach an outcome there. So I think we need to recognize that that will be necessary from time to time. I think those processes need to be adapted to the reality of the pandemic, so that early conflict resolution is available through mediation and other alternative dispute resolution. So then this is more for the individual issues that might come up in a community or between a mall and the patrons of a mall or what have you. And I know that the Manitoba's Human Rights Commission offers pre-complaint mediation, for example. So those kinds of services need to be very available. Courts have some mediation capacity as well. And agencies that are required to apply human rights legislation, which is broad and across the board, they also need to have that capacity so that decisions can be made quickly in the event that we haven't done that work that we needed to do, applied that human rights lens appropriately and come up with a good solution. And then when you do have to formally engage the court or the decision maker, they need to be able to do so very quickly and also communicate the decision quickly. So thank you for the question. I'm looking forward to the comments that will be coming.
Thank you, Sarah. I think it is important that we apply human rights standards in program or policy development and build a capacity of professionals who are developing these policies or service providers who are assisting vulnerable populations. Dr. Kawser, you're next. What kind of measures do you feel should be in place to help navigate these human rights violations that have risen from COVID-19? The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Khujista. Thank you so much. Ladies and gentlemen, I think Sarah has kind of given us the clue that policymakers, please do use human rights lens when you are in the policy table and a policy is forthcoming at all level, city, province, and federal level. So I think I'll start with that one. And I'll just add a couple of points with this in this discussion that in policy making, it's tough. We do understand. Pandemic has, added anxiety at all places. Policymakers have to react, have to take decisions on a daily basis. That is understandable. And it is enormous pressure onto the policymakers, especially the doctors and the public health officials at the provincial level, and so on and so forth. And this is kind of the tension that we always see. And hurriedly, our decision creates enormous challenges down to the on the population. Especially if we look into our province, we have is actually not in our province globally. The amount of struggles that we are going through due to COVID-19 and its impacts on freedom of movement, freedom of expression, this is really monumental. And for example, in our vocabulary, we have already adopted words like anti-vaxxers. So there are enormous protests against the governments, and which I think again a very unique situation within the last, I would say, decades, that the particular citizen groups is voicing concerns and protesting against their own government with regards to their freedom of movement and freedom of choice, if I might say so. And this is why it is so important that policymakers do take notice of various situations that might arise due to imposition of restrictions and etc. And given my humble experience in researching extremism and violence, I do see a rising tendency of protest throughout the globe, especially if you are aware the upcoming, or maybe the wave that we are in, fourth wave induced by Omicron variant. We have seen how it is impacting people's choice and movement in Europe, in, for example, Netherlands, and there were riots actually in the street. So this is really problematic for us to understand how the policies should be crafted so that it is equal. And so it is difficult, we do understand. But as I said, as quoting Sarah, that if we have that human rights lens right in front of us, then I think it would give us additional tools to craft our policies so that inequality is not further perpetuated against another vulnerable groups. I would also like to add that policy making is, of course, a craft, and sometimes we call it as an art and etc. But I have seen in the past with my own research that most of our policies are actually we create and we intend to use it focusing the majority population in mind, because that is how it happens. I mean, in general, in a very generic term. And when we talk about majority population, majority group of people, automatically the marginalized or socially vulnerable or underrepresented groups are not there in the table in the get-go. And so this is how I see that a problem in intervention in terms of pandemic and other social conflicts. I would like to conclude here by saying that intervention is really context driven, because in Manitoba what is going to work is not going to work in Alberta. So I'm not being judgmental here, dear audience, please, I apologize, but I'm just comparing these two situations, because our health policy in Manitoba and intervention in COVID-19 pandemic is way different than Alberta and Saskatchewan. So these are pretty much the things that we need to keep in mind when we are asked to develop a policy for intervention. And as I said, I'm going back to that fundamental two aspects, that freedom of movement and freedom of expression. These are fundamental to all human beings, and any kind of imposition would create resistance. And as I said, past 21 months, we have seen how people gathered together, regular people, absolutely regular home-based people, who have never imagined to come on the street. They have come and protested against lockdowns and other restrictive measures. So here you go, Khujista.
Thank you, Dr. Kawser. Like you said, the situation is constantly changing. Issues and norms are always changing, and it's difficult to stay on top. But I think those who are in these policy level positions, whose policy decisions can have an impact, need to be ready and equipped to be able to respond to these issues. So I think this is the end of our panel discussion. We're at time, but we'll now open the floor for some questions. We already have a few, and we'll try to get through them as much as we can. So let's start with our first question, and it's open to both our speakers. The first question is, what measures should we take to bolster equity in schools and education?
I would request Sarah to go first.
Thank you. Great question. And I know that both the Department of Education, all of the school divisions and schools and school personnel have been really working on this and thinking about it. And in some ways, schools and children have borne some of the worst of the pandemic in terms of disruption to their lives and so on. I'm not an expert, so I think I can only sort of speak in generalities, but I would say that it's important to be thinking about already vulnerable populations and how the various changes in the way that the education is being delivered may be impacting those populations and those families. And and then to be providing additional supports and probably continuing to monitor that. And so that, because those issues will change over time. So I suspect that children with disabilities, for example, during times when if school, sort of being in the physical school wasn't available, may have been receiving, they and the families may have been receiving supports that were essential to the children's development and education. And that might have been a difficult need to meet when children were needing to stay home with their families. And so that's just one example, but I think, again, just kind of going back to basics, taking that equity lens, looking at what changes are being made, and then thinking, okay, who are the different groups of students and families that are being affected here? What are their needs, and what do we need to be doing differently and specially to meet those needs, instead of expecting everyone to fit within the same box?
And I would like to add with Sarah that education system, to my understanding and own experience, is also about socialization in class. As a human being, Homo sapiens, we are actually, I think, in our DNA, there is something that we need to interact with others in a space. So that is my own understanding that COVID-19 has severely impacted. Well, we have passed through this phase of total virtual, teaching. Now, gradually, our institutions are opening up, and in-person classes have increased in many of the universities, and our school boards have opened. But always there is a risk of spread of the disease and through the social interactions. So this is one challenge that I think is going to stay with us for some time. And also, I would like to add that vaccination rates increasing, and our children are getting vaccinated now at a faster rate, and which is a good sign that the more we have vaccines, then I think it's a added layer of protection against these virus. And we have to be also careful that this vaccination is, it is given to our, vulnerable people and socially marginalized people in an equal rate. And also, please do not forget, dear audience, that it is also not very easy to bring people into the vaccination centers. So schools have opened up their own ways of vaccinating children, but this is another layer of problem that I see and challenge, that motivating people to come to the centers and vaccinating their children. So this is how I think we have to proceed. But I do strongly believe that if the policies are in place encouraging people to vaccinate their children, and then more we are going into that space of more secure teaching environment. And I would just end by saying that education is partly a social activity. It is not only sharing some theories and examples and exams. It is part of socialization. We learn through socialization, and we learn, we acquire knowledge through socialization. Thank you.
Thank you. Agreed. We need to ensure that students in vulnerable populations are getting vaccinated, monitor and understand the needs of students, and taking an equity lens to meet those needs. The next question is for Dr. Kawser. The question is, can you tell us, in your experience working with refugee populations, how can we ensure not to further deepen the impact of COVID-19 on the progress that has been made to help refugee populations? The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Khujista, for asking this, I would say, another important question. So our work from Conflict and Resilience Research Institute, Canada, is about educating young female adolescent Rohingya in the camps in Bangladesh, mostly now, but we intend to do it in Myanmar as well in the future. Our own experience shows that COVID-19 induced restrictions. It has impacted the whole process of accessing education in the camps. However, I would say one interesting data that we all are aware of the modeling, COVID-19 modeling, and the public health officials always use, and they come out and say that, okay, we envisage second wave like this, third wave like that. So a World Health Organization and I think John Hopkins, so they are expert in this data modeling. So in 2020, they forecast that due to COVID-19, there will be enormous cases in Rohingya camps, and death tolls will go in thousands and all these things. But interestingly, death toll is very minimum in Rohingya camps, and it is not even thousands now. And infection rate is also very, very minimum. And those who are not very aware of this Rohingya crisis, so nearly 1.3 million Rohingyas are now being hosted in southern part of Bangladesh. Yes, you have heard it right, 1.3 million. So the Kutupalong camp, the name of the camp, it is largest in the world, which houses just shy of 500,000 people altogether. So you can compare our population in Winnipeg versus the population of a single camp. There are 34 camps. So going back to the question that our moderator kind of asked me. So access. So how the education is delivered pre-COVID-19 period. So NGOs like ours and others, we used to go to the camps, and there are spaces, education spaces. You go and you held very traditional way classes, and you have seen in our promo that we there are some number of classes, but that has totally stopped because the government of Bangladesh has imposed total restriction in going into the camps from outside. So definitely the delivery is impacted, severely impacted. Second thing I would say, the most damaging part is it has kind of created problem in continuity. So let's say pre-COVID-19, there were some progress in delivering lessons of let's say 5th or 6th grade to young females. Now within this past nearly 20 months, due to this inaccessibility, the continuity is disrupted. So we don't know exactly how some of the older students are coping up because we don't know where they are. So this is really a problem I see. And thirdly, I would mention that specifically our target group is, as you understand, young females. So young females in the camp, they're already in the disadvantageous position already by default. One is social, one is cultural, and of course there are other aspects. I'm not going into details, but they're already in that situation right from the beginning. So these COVID-19 things have again added extra layer of problem for them because they are even more less accessible to educational facilities, coming to the camps and taking direct lessons. And there is no question of remote things, as you understand. In the camps, there is no facilities of internet and etc. So remote learning is absolutely it's not an idea at all in the camps. So these are, I think, major problems that we are facing in camps. However, for the audience, let me also share that we are developing a remote learning technology for the children in the camps. We can deliver it remotely because we see the rate of infection of COVID-19 in Bangladesh is gradually down to a very and I would say a reasonable extent, and a part of population is being transferred to an island. So we are going to deliver some model of pilot project in the near future, and we look forward the situation how COVID-19 impacts such a system. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Kawser. I think COVID-19 has given us a development shock. A lot of development programs have come to a halt. But like I said earlier, we need to continue to commit to promoting equity. And I'm also glad to hear that you're navigating ways to still deliver education-related programs in Rohingya camps. So I hope that works out. I think this should be our final question for both speakers. What can we do as individuals or as a community to respond to the racism against racialized populations that have stemmed from COVID-19?
Sarah, to go first again, or?
Thank you. Yeah, I can do that. This is a great question. It was the one area that I didn't touch on in my remarks, but is also a very significant issue and equality issue that's arisen in the pandemic. So as individuals, when we hear racist comments, see racist behavior, I think as long as it's safe, and you have to determine whether it's safe, because you can be in a situation where it isn't. If you're able to, you need to stop that conversation, say something, and show the person who, especially if there's someone who's a racialized person who's present, show them that you're in solidarity with them, and show the person making the comment that it's not acceptable. And you just have to do it. We all have to do it. We all have a responsibility. And so that's sort of as an individual. I think also we can support, if you're thinking about any activity that you do, we all do different things to be part of our communities and support our communities. Think about the particular needs of racialized communities and Indigenous communities right now. And are there ways that you can provide your support to those communities? So I guess I'll start with that and then turn it over to my co-panelist.
Thank you so much. I think it is really interesting to bring the racism dynamics into this pandemic, but we have seen enough within this 21 months. It is a reality. So I thought of allude to this theory of black swan. Dr. Nassim Taleb brilliantly posed this metaphor, and he's a famous person. We all quote him. But I just wanted to, extrapolate this idea of black swan, because an unprecedented event. We never knew this pandemic would come and it would create such a devastation, all these things. So it's a black swan event, very exceptional event, and it has redefined many of our human relationships, intergroup relationships, how we talk, how we interact with social structures, i.e. governments, globally. It is not only Canada, North America. So I think racism is, kind of, I would like to see it as pretty normal, natural things. We all have our biases. So I'm going to use this word, that we have our own biases for many reasons. The way we are brought up, then we come to a multicultural setting like Canada, so we are aware of it. But as Sarah mentioned, that if we are aware of it, then we also know how to stop it or how to deal with it. So this is important, that we should be aware of our own biases against others. And I think most importantly, intervention wise, we should not be a passive bystander. And again, I'm going back to Sarah's comment, very important, that we should do something. And this is really important for me to mention on the perspective of genocide, because when studying Rohingya crisis, I did some extensive research on genocide cases all over the world. And this is one thing, is that the perpetrator creates this environment of genocide because of bystanders, because of inaction of certain group of people in the society who thinks that they don't have to do anything. And this fear and this inaction is actually one of the drivers of perpetration of genocide. So I'm going back to this comment that yes, if you see racism, stop it, do something. Do not be a passive bystanders, because your action would create a lot of impacts right on the ground, because this is happening right in front of you. And COVID-19 has, as I said, it has given us so much of experience of dealing with racism in our day-to-day lives. Thank you.
An important thing anyone can do, and wherever you are, and Just don't be bystanders. If you see something, say something. That's the least you can do. So this is our last question for today. We're at time. So thank you, speakers, for responding to our questions, and thank you, attendees, for listening in today. I'll keep this short and say that we started our 16 days of activism with a webinar discussing the elimination of violence against women and what can be done to create an equitable environment for them to succeed. And today, we're ending our activism by talking about the gaps in human rights protection and addressing the inequalities that have stemmed from COVID-19. I also want to say that it is easy to write words in a legal document, but it's much harder to make them meaningful and for the words to come true. And in order to uphold these human rights, we need to be having these conversations within our community, with activists, human rights lawyers, and implementing professionals, so we can work together to fulfill what is written. And to end, I think it's definitely possible to reduce these gaps, advance human rights, and build a world that is more resilient and also sustainable. So thank you to our audience for attending this webinar, and thank you, Sarah and Dr. Kawser, for taking the time to discuss with us the steps that need to be taken to mitigate human rights violations and create equal opportunities for all. I will now turn over the mic to our Executive Director, Dr. Kawser Ahmed, for some closing remarks. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Khujista. Before I really officially conclude, let me welcome Sarah for her last words. Sarah, please.
Oh, thank you. I just want to thank you for welcoming me here today and to be part of this wonderful discussion. And I couldn't agree more that we can make change happen, and we've seen changes in our own lifetimes. And there are many more of us who want to live in an equal, a world that's equitable and where we all belong and we're each other's brothers and sisters. And this is part of building that world. So thank you again.
Thank you so much. I would like to express my gratitude to our moderator and today's planner, Khujista Rahman, to design this whole webinar. And this is our special event that we have already thought of, activism of 16 days. That started on 25th of November, and we held another webinar there at that on that day, titled "Elimination of Violence Against Women." So today is our culmination of activism, as she rightly mentioned. Thank you so much, Khujista, for planning it. The audience, I would conclude formally by saying that the concept of human rights is basically, as Professor Noah Hariri said, an idea, a concept, a perception, and this is why it matters most. And this is why Conflict and Resilience Research Institute invites people to dialogue about the problems and challenges of human rights implementation. And this is why we are here before you with the idea of inequality imposed by COVID-19 tonight. If you remember, I started with the quote of Eleanor Roosevelt by saying that where from human rights starts. And I will end today's session by saying that it starts right from your heart. Look into your heart. Look where you stay, wherever you go. This is where the human rights starts. And if you can practice that, I hope we are going to see a more equitable world in the future. And with this, I would like to conclude. Stay well, stay safe, and thank you once again for being with us. Bye-bye.